name is Ben Sacherich. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I want to give a talk today about Power Query and how you can benefit from it as an Access or a data professional. So I'm going to turn off my video now, and you can see the slides. So my name's fairly unique. If you wanted to look me up on LinkedIn, I'm probably going to be the only Sacherich with any kind of technical skills. I've been working with Visual Basic, Access, SQL Server, Excel for a long time. More recently, started using Alpha Anywhere. Kind of put that to the side for now. A long time ago, I used Omnis 7, which was a rapid application development system similar to Access, but it worked on the Mac and the PC, which is its niche. One of the things I like to do when I'm working on the computer is find ways to make things faster, quicker, less keystrokes, less repetitive. I'm a little bit nerdy in that way. Since for the last 18 years, I've been working at an engineering design company, and I've had the opportunity to travel to lots of places, which is kind of nice. Most of the time I'm sitting at a desk in Pittsburgh working on projects for other offices. I hardly ever do any work in Pittsburgh, but I like being at the office instead of at home where there's too many distractions. I put a map of some of the places the places I've been for work, and that's been fun. And I've never had to stay in one place for very long, so that's good. You kind of get there, get the feel of what the situation is, and then come home and do the work. So the agenda tonight is I want to cover over some assumptions. Jim's already told me that you guys are all good at Access, and that's great to make it easier to explain some of this stuff. I want to tell you what Power Query is, and then I want to go through the editor, the interface for that, and then I'm going to show you examples of how I've used it. So the assumptions here are, you know the difference between Excel formulas, Excel macros, and VBA and SQL. I want to show you another way besides those ways that you can transform data, clean it up, and make it usable. One of the catch here is in Excel there's a thing called a named range. I'm going to talk about that. It's basically a name for a cell or a group of cells that's usable instead of the address for it. I don't know why it skipped a line there, but I'm assuming that you've, I know why it skipped that. There. I'm assuming you know what good data looks like. It's structured, normalized, has a unique record identifier. Maybe the data is doesn't have other data around it, like headings, footers, margins, whatever that might prevent you from just pulling it into a table with Access query. And the final assumption is that you've had problems of your own dealing with bad data, where clients said, hey, import this data, it's the best I got, and you've written some crazy VBA to try to handle all the different situations. You guys hear me okay? Am I moving at an okay pace?
Perfect. You're doing fine.
What is this thing you're talking about called good data?
No, there's no such thing.
No such thing. Yeah. Just kidding.
Yeah,
okay. I was hoping that you guys would feel some of that pain. So what is Power Query? You may have heard of it if you've heard of Power BI, but Power Query is a standalone on its own. You don't have to have Power BI. In Excel 2010 and 2013, it was an add-in, and that's maybe why you didn't hear about it if you didn't move up to a new version very quickly. And that's what happened to me. I just found out about Power Query a year ago. And it's on the ribbon. It's called Get and Transform, and I'll show you that. when I pull up Excel. It also is in Power BI, which is a software for creating charts and business analytics. The reason I like it outside of Power BI is the reason it exists in Power BI is to funnel data towards its reporting engine. And I don't want to funnel data towards a report. I want to funnel data, clean it up, and put it into a database. Because I want to do more with that data than just report. When would you need Power Query? It's really useful for something you could almost do manually, but you don't want to do it 100 times. If it's a job that you could have an intern do who knew Excel, maybe moving columns around, deleting columns, just shuffling things around, Power Query is really good for that. It's not going to do everything for you, so it kind of follows the 80-20 rule. A lot of what you need you can do right from the GUI. Some of it you need to write some special formulas in its scripting language, and some of it you'd have to do more advanced things, maybe some VBA. I mentioned a scripting language, and that's what makes Power Query, in my mind, way better than its competitors. It has a language called M in it, which lets you, because it's a language, after you build a series of steps to clean up data, you can copy and paste those and email them to a buddy, or you can refer back to them when you want to find out how you did something in the past. You can make backups that way. And a competitor to Power BI would be Tableau, if you've heard of Tableau. And as far as I know, it doesn't have any scripting language. So the steps you use to clean up data aren't things you can extract and compare to previous steps. I stole this chart, and it kind of gives you an idea of where Power Query fits. You get a lot of bang for your buck with it pretty quickly without a lot of experience. So I want to show you the Power Query editor in a kind of a static image before I go dig into it. If you're in Excel and you activate this, window will pop up, and the data you're working with is right visible in the center. It's not editable, but when you apply things to it, like if I were to click this button here and pick to sort by that column, it might create a new step over here called sort, which it already did. So in that case, it would just append to that step. Maybe if I wanted to filter for electrical disciplines here, these are, in an engineering sense, there's going to be a lot of my examples. So if you think about the different types of engineers you can be, we have departments or disciplines, we call that. So you got your steps over here. Your steps roll up under a query, and so that's the name of your query. If you've made other queries while you've been in this, they will list up over here, and you can collapse this panel. The current row that you're working on, if you want to see the actual data, that shows here. Then this area hides and comes back whenever you, depending on what you click on. If I click on a column, it's going to hide it, but if I click on a row, it shows it. This here is kind of like the formula bar in Excel, but this is the M language in here, and you don't have to write this. If you were to hit a button on the ribbon and apply a new step, it's going to write that for you, but you can go into that and edit that. So if I told it I wanted to rename a column, it would create the step, but then I can go into the step and change the name it renames it to. Are you guys following along?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, any questions?
Not yet.
So it looks like the steps, the applied steps, are just sort of logging like you would record a macro, right?
It is. I like to say that. Yeah, it's like using the macro recorder, except you can go back to any step at any time and change it.
That's awesome.
And you can reorder your steps. And I'm going to bring up that order of operation is something you have to keep in mind when you do some of these manipulations, because you may filter it and then realize that you filtered out something that you needed, and so you want to adjust your steps. And it's really nice. You can right click on this and say move up, or you can click it and drag it and change the order of things. Now sometimes it breaks your script, and I hopefully we'll see that. Any other questions? Okay. So I'm going to start off with a demo that is not, well, I'm going to pull data from a website, and that's not normally what you would need to be doing. Let me make sure I get the right page come up here. If you guys are familiar with the Internet Movie Database, this is a page they have where they have the ranked of the top 250 movies. So in this scenario here, we're going to imagine that we want to be able to pull that data down into Excel, and at any time we want to be able to refresh that. So in Excel, these two sections here are what normally known as Power Query, and maybe older versions of Excel it would have said Power Query there, and they've called it Get and Transform and Queries and Connections. And what we want to do is get data from a web page. So we're going to click this, and we're going to put in our web address in there. This is a little bit slow here. It's going out and analyzing that web page and trying to figure out how many tables are in that web page. I think it's going to find 3. So it found some document header, it found some document footer, and it found what we're looking for here. So this is what I want to work with, and so I hit edit. And this is our first chance to see the Power Query editor. Does all of this fit on your screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
I think so.
Yeah, Ben, we're at 1080p, so we have the full shebang.
Great, great. Okay, so there's the data that it pulled back. It automatically put in some steps over here. So the first step is, hey, what's the address we want to go to? This is our source. And when this step is applied, we see those 3 tables come back, and we've chosen table, the data table. Is that what it was? I don't want to get too lost in this. We picked it. It wrote the code for us. We'll just take it for that. Then the third step it put in there is it made a guess at what the data type is for each one of these columns. So it thinks this is text. It thinks this column is decimal and text, and text. Text is the default. So the first thing I want to do is get rid of these columns that I don't want to see. So I'm just going to pick those columns and remove them. And so you can see it created a step in here to remove those columns. And now I want to take this column and I want to split it into the number, the title, and the year. So I'm going to use this feature here, which is split column by delimiter. And I can see that every one of these starts with a number and then a period. So I'm going to tell it to split at the leftmost period. And it did that for me. And it also applied a change type. So it then reanalyzed that and guessed that this was a number and this is text. You can see that here. Now I'm going to do the same on this column. I want to split it, and we also can see that same option on the right-click menu. So I want to split this by the open parenthesis, but there could be multiple parentheses. There could be a title of a movie that has parentheses in it, so I want to make sure I say the leftmost. No, I want to do the rightmost left parenthesis. So I do that.
All right.
Yeah, I had to say that carefully.
It's good for us dyslexic people.
Yeah, I don't see a movie title here that has parentheses in the name, but it could happen. So then I want to take this one and I just want to do a replace, and wherever it finds a right parenthesis, replace it with nothing. Now we've got our year. This column here, it actually has an extra space at the beginning, so I want to trim that. So I'll do the transform trim, and that's going to eliminate beginning and trailing spaces. And I want this to be a year, so I'm going to make it be a whole number, so it sees it as a number. And then I want to change my titles, and I'm just pressing F2 up here like you would in Excel, or you could right click and hit rename. And rename, and what do I want to call this? Release year. There's not much more I want to do after this. I could sort the data, or obviously they're already in the right order. You can see my steps over here that I applied. Any step that has a gear on it, I can go back and edit. So I could hit that and get that wizard to come back up. I picked this as a quick example. I'm going to hit close and load, and what it's going to do, you see my Power Query editor is over top of my Excel window. And a tip I want to give you is when you're in Power Query, it's a modal window. You can't click back on Excel. If you're trying to make the data look like a destination format, it's a little bit tricky to be able to see what that format is. What I do sometimes is I take a screenshot of that other, the destination Excel layout that I want to have, and then I can just look at the screenshot because you're kind of stuck in this window. So I'll hit close and load, and it's going to take this data, it's going to create a new sheet, it's going to create a table on that sheet with this data in it. Now, I don't know if you're familiar in Excel with what a table is. A table is its own type of object. You can see I get these extra options on my ribbon, and it recognizes the extents of this table. It gives me some other options like banded rows, which I can turn off. When I scroll down, you see it takes the column headings become the table headings. I can write a formula that refers to a column by its name. So I can say this equals the title, and you can see how it wrote that formula. It says go to the headers and get the rank from the rank column. I'm not going to do more with that because I'm not really trying to show you how to do tables. But I want to point out that Power Query works with tables, named ranges, or outside documents like external Excel files, CSV files, websites. If I'm in an Excel file and I want to link to data that's in that Excel file already, it has to point to a table or named range. It can't, and I'll show you later what I mean when I'm saying this. So finally on this, I want to show you that it's linked to the website. I can come in there and I can type in stuff, and if I right click and hit refresh, or I go up to the data menu and I hit refresh, it's going to rerun those steps and pull down that data for me. And it's doing it now there. And if you see on the right side of my screen, I have this panel called Queries and Connections. This is toggled with this button on the ribbon. And the queries that I've made appear over here. This was the pie I made before I put the other one in the oven, and just in case I messed up, I'll be doing that a lot here. I want to show you how it works, but I may mess up something and want to show you the completed stage. Any questions?
Nope. Nope.
Okay. I want to show you now a more complex example, a real-world example I've had to deal with. I work in an engineering company, and engineers love Excel. They want everything to feel like Excel, but they don't quite understand that you don't get clean data all the time with Excel. They built this template that allows them to forecast work on future projects. So here's the department. Here's the name of the guy. Here's his employee number. We'll ignore this for a second. Here's what level he is of an engineer. And then it's kind of like a pivot, and they want to see with all the different work weeks across the top, how many hours they want to plan that person to work. So they've been using Excel files like this for a long time, and they now want this data to be populated into a database. They wanted me to write something to pull this data into a database. So I got them to agree to some rules, so we locked down some fields. But one thing we can't lock down is what date they start on. So if they wanted to start on September 1st, they could type that in there and all these other columns would change. And you know that if you're importing something, the column is pretty important. The column name either has to be unique or the column position has to be where you expect it. It's kind of the rule of thumb for importing data. So I want to show you how I'm going to use Power Query to transform this data into something that's usable for me. Another stipulation that they have is that there's some people in here are listed as to be determined. They don't know the name of the person they're going to use. They know they need someone, but that person's not an employee yet. They don't have an employee number, but they want to assign them hours. Every time they get a TBD person, they want it to stay a unique record in the final result. On the other hand, they could have people like Gavin Hope, who may be assigned to 2 different tasks, and I've hidden the task column here to simplify this. So he's working 8 hours a week on one task and 16 on the other. We want Gavin's work to be rolled up. So I have to treat some of the data differently on my roll-up. So I'm going to show you how I would do that with Power Query. In one version of this, I did the Power Query inside the template that I issued to everybody, and then I found out that wasn't such a good idea because we had to keep making tweaks to the code. So I'm going to pull it up from a version I already have. I thought I had that file folder on top. There it is. So the way I want to do this is when they fill out that template, they give it to me, I put it into a folder, and then I run Power Query against it, and it'll clean the data up, and it'll look like this data right here. And I'm going to show you through the steps how I will do that. So I'll make a new sheet, and I'm going to tell it that I want to get data from an existing Excel file. And there's my file. And I have to pick the sheet or the named range that I want to pull back and hit edit. And again, it created a few steps for me. A step showing the hard-coded path name, which I can show you later how we can make that dynamic. What sheet it selected, and then it went ahead and guessed at what data type I want for each of my columns. I'm going to maximize this screen. So I don't need to worry about the change type because you can see that my column headings are down here on row 3. So I'm just going to delete that step. And I'm going to tell it that I want it to remove the top 2 rows. So I hit that, and I'm going to pick 2. So now my header row is right here on row 1, and I'm going to pick the step that says use first row as headers. Now that when it does that, it also tries to evaluate the data type of every column. So I'll leave that step in there. Now that I've done that, I can't show you back because I can't jump back very easily, but the file that I was pulling in from had work weeks across the top, but it also had, at one point, may have had data out to the right past the last date. See, the last date is June 12th, and now I've got some other columns here that are just named column. And your first pass through this, you might say, hey, I'm going to pick those and I'm going to remove them. And I'll show you what that does. It creates a step here that says remove these columns by their name. Now what happens if next time I don't have a column 75? Well, then the whole script will fail. And if I have more than 75, it'll also could mess up something. I'll show you here about the scripting language. So all these steps here are written as a script. And I can hit this advanced editor. This is the entire script. I can copy this and paste it, email it to somebody. I can put it into Notepad++ or OneNote to work on it or archive it. And the reason I'm showing you this now is because I want to put in a step here that I've learned over time that will remove any column that has a heading that contains the word column. This is the right time to want to put that step in there. So I have that already written, and I keep it in a log file so I can pull it up. So now I've created a new step that takes the change type step. That's the change type step, using it as its source. And I think I should show you this in a more graphic or a highlighted way. And take this. Okay, oops, and I'm missing, this requires a comma at the end of each line, but not at the last line. Okay, there's no errors. I'll show you that this gets rid of any column named column. You can see my last column now is that. But I want to show you a slide that explains this a little bit better. Show you this here. So every step you make has a name. You can rename that step. And the next step builds upon that step. So you can see that the removed columns step uses the changed type step. And then the split column by delimiter step uses the remove column step. Hopefully that makes the language a little bit easier to understand. Another thing that's kind of hard to get used to is that if your step contains spaces in the name, it puts it in quotes and prefixes it with a pound sign. That's not something that I don't think SQL or VBA programmers are used to. And a few things that make it worse are that, I'll show you. I don't know if you guys are familiar with like double click and drag. It's a really nice way in most editors, even Outlook, to select. You can see I'm just double clicking the word table and I drag and it's going to pick up the words as I move along, except in this editor. In this editor, if I want to grab this pound sign all the way down to the last quote, and I'm not going to double click and drag, I'm just going to click and hold my mouse, and as I move over, you see it just grabbed the left parenthesis. And then I come to the last quote and it grabs the comma. Really annoying. It's probably it's in my top 5 of irritations of using this. So if I wanted to grab this and copy and paste it, I have to hold the shift key and use the keyboard, because using the mouse is just not cooperating very well. And that's one reason why I tend to rename some of my columns or my steps with underscores. so I can get a nicer name like this. This also, when I follow this by putting underscores, it helps me see steps that I made versus the ones it automatically made. So I can get back to that step at a later time. Any questions?
Okay, hey Ben.
Yep.
So can you work with a spreadsheet with multiple tabs and pull all the tabs in at one time?
Yes, you can. If they all have the same column structure?
Yes.
Yes, you can. You can, because one of my steps here is this step here actually lists all the sheets. So I could go to this step and say, hey, I only want to see sheets. And I can process data right from here.
Excellent.
We're getting a little off track, but this is a good time to ask about that. One of my sheets is called employee list. Let's say I just wanted that sheet. I don't mind jumping around. The intent isn't to teach you how to use Power Query, but to show you the capabilities of it, because it's got so many different things you can do with it. But as you see when I click on it, it shows me down below. This is an actual table of data. This is that sheet. I can expand this and tell it to give me all the columns that are in there. Oh, and by the way, because I'm halfway down my list, it's actually going to insert this right in the middle of that, which will probably break the other steps. But on one of my sheets, I did have an employee list, and you can see that here. Here's names, employee numbers, cities, and I could process this just like I'm processing the labor loader sheet. And see, now we've broken it. So I'm gonna go back. Hopefully I do this right. Yeah, it goes back to navigation. See if we're back here. So yes, we could tell it to process all sheets. You can also tell this to process a folder full of files. And that's one of the examples I have is a customer gave me 100 files, say, they're all in the same format, and they want to do an analysis of that data in those files. And I'm able to tell Power Query, point to a folder, read all the files in those folders, and process them. And it's great. I'm going to continue on my steps here unless there's another question.
Nope.
Okay.
Go on.
So something I want to do, and I talked to you earlier about like order of operation. I want to make sure I'm working with easy to use titles on my columns. So I'm going to rename this now, because if I rename it later and I do anything with that column, it'll break the steps. So these are some key columns that I'm going to be working with, and I want to make sure they have underscores just because they're easier to work with, and that's the name they're going to be when I push them into my database in the end. Another step that I wanted to do, let's see, because we promoted headers, when we were on our raw data here, our first row of data was row 4. I want to keep that number around, because if I find bad data, I want to be able to track it down in the Excel file. So I'm going to add a step here to create an index column. So I just did that. It created an index column all the way to the right, and I want to tell that the first row is row 4, because we've already promoted the headers, and I want it to count by 1. So now we have an index column all the way on the right. And I could take this column and I could move it over to the left where it makes more sense for me, but I'll show you why that's not going to be a good idea. I'm going to say go to the beginning. I could drag it if I wanted to. What it just did is it created a step that basically says reorder all the columns, and here's all the hard-coded names. I don't want steps that have hard-coded names for these pivoted columns. So I'm going to take that step out of there, and I've found ways to get the columns in the order I want without doing that. The next step I'm going to do is remove columns I don't care about. Actually, before I do that, I did have a validation step that I hid in my worksheet. I guess you can't see it now, but that it would validate whether each row was good or not, because I have a VLOOKUP that tells me if the name and the employee number together are on the same row in another table. So I want to only look at the good rows. So I'm going to remove the bad ones, just show you the good ones. And now I don't need this column anymore. It's kind of interesting that you could put a filter on something and remove that column. In fact, I don't need these other columns, the mock name, the task. I'm going to remove all of those rows, and it's going to append that remove to the existing remove column because I was on that step. It's kind of nice. If you see another column that you don't care about, you just go back to that step and then do it, and it'll ask if you want to insert it. I can show you here. I'll just sort on this column, and I'll go back to the remove columns and say, hey, I also want to remove this step. It's asked me if I want to insert a step, but actually it's going to, most of the time, it's going to append that rule to that step that's already in there. Now, I can't bring it back without coming into here and actually physically removing that step. I'll give you some other tips about the Power Query Editor. There's no undo. That's kind of another frustration, is that step I just put in there, there's no way to get back, or I just deleted a column that I had removed. I can't get that back. The only way that I've found out to work with this is to occasionally come into this screen, go in the Notepad++, paste it in there, and that's my snapshot for right now. And that way, if I screw up something in here, if I accidentally do that and hit OK, and I can't figure out where I broke it, at least I can go back to my Notepad++, copy that, paste it back in here. There's no save on this Power Query Editor either. So the only way I can save what I've done is by closing the Power Query Editor. So I'll hit close and load. It's going to create a new sheet. It's going to put the result of what I've done so far here. Now I can save the file. Now my script is saved. Then I can come back over to the right side here and go back to my query that I was working on and right click and hit edit. And it's called labor loader, and it's called labor loader right there. My database is called the TCT that I'm going to put this data in. And I like to use the word prelim as kind of a suffix because this is going to be a preliminary query that I'm going to actually have other things build on. And because I already have one named that, I'll put the DAAUG suffix on there. I'm going to take out that sort that I didn't intend to put there. Okay, at this point, I have the data that I want, only the columns I want. Now I need to summarize this data because in some cases, a person's name is in there twice and I need to roll up their data. And it's hard to roll up data when I can't specify the column name hard-coded in a hard-coded fashion. So what I want to do with this data is you can recognize that it looks like it's in a pivot. We want to unpivot this data. This is an awesome feature of Power Query. So I can select all the columns that I want to unpivot, unpivot, and then I can go to the transform menu and I can hit the unpivot option. Now when it does that, it's going to write the query or the step with these hard-coded named columns. I don't want that because that may not be those column names next time. Here's where Power Query is cool. You pick the columns that aren't the pivoted columns and you pick from the menu, unpivot other columns. Now it writes a step. So it just unpivoted, and now I have an attribute, which is my column heading, and I have the value, which is my hours. And all it wrote was this line of code right here. So it didn't name all of those columns. Now, one of the things I want to do here is I know this is hours, so I can make a step that renames this column, but actually I can just come in here, and at the position of this parameter for that function, I can just call it hours. And then it renames it there. I'm not going to do it with this step yet because I'm going to do some work on that. Now, I don't know if any of you caught this, but I did make a mistake, and I did this on purpose. I also had a column called index, and now it's unpivoted that. So I am going to come back to this step here, and I'm going to put index in there because that's another column I don't want it to unpivot. And when I do that, now I get that column back, and it's not in here now. I'm looking at my notes. You have any questions?
No questions here.
Okay. Okay. So I don't want to work with any rows that have hours of 0. So I'll take out those. Those aren't useful to me at all. And it's thinking this column is alphabetic, and I want to change this column to be decimal. So I'll see decimals, obviously. Now I want to take this column and turn it into a column name that is useful to my database. My database, well, I'll take a tangent here and say, this is the way you should store data in a database, where you have every work week as a row, not as a column. Unfortunately, the way my database was designed, it actually stores the data as a row, as a column. There's a column for every work week, which is kind of bad because we run out of work weeks once in a while and we have to add columns to it. This is one of those, build this database as fast as you can. We only need it for a few months, and now we're on year 2. So we're living with a quick decision. But I need to make this column match the name that that matches the database. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this add column. I'm going to create a new column. I want the column to be called looking at my notes so I say this right, because I got to paste this in again later. Week of year. And the formula I want to put in here is I want to take the year portion of the year, multiply it by 100, so I move the decimal over, and then I want to take the work week. Oh, I should do this. I got to convert this to a date first, sorry. So I'm going to say, I'm going to rename this step also and call it change attribute to date. Now I can come into, I'll do it the way through the wizard. Custom, this is called week of year. I'm going to paste in a formula that I already wrote. Working with dates, I had to do some Google searching to figure out what the right syntax was. I couldn't find it necessarily in the menu here. Maybe it is in here, but I couldn't find it. So I wrote that. Table add column. And it doesn't seem like it did what I wanted it to. I'm going to just jump into the advanced editor and paste in that. There we go. Sorry that I messed that up, but that's what happens in a live demo. So now I have my year and a work week, and that's the way it's named in my destination table. Now I want to add a prefix to every one of those to be my column name. So I'm going to add a prefix. These are all forecast hours, and our column happens to be named like that. So now I have a column name that matches what my database uses, and I don't need this column anymore, and I'm going to remove it. Now this has all the data I need in a better format so I can run calculations on it. But now I have to go two different directions. I have to calculate my TBD, to be determined people differently than I calculate the people with a real name. So because I made this its own query, it's named that way. I can come over here and I can see that query. Now I want to make a new query that refers back to that query. And I haven't found quite the best way to do this. I'm going to just duplicate that query. I'm going to call this TCT no TBD DAAUG. And I'm going to edit that query and take out all this stuff and just say that it equals the name of the query I want to use as its source in. Oh, another thing I'll mention to you, that this language is case sensitive. You're not used to that as a VBA and SQL developer, but it will be unhappy if you don't get this case right. Even if you had something in quotes where you're trying to filter by a value, it can get a little sticky if you don't remember that. So basically, I'm making a brand new query that refers to another query as its source. In this case, I only want to look at employee numbers that start with TBD. So I'll say begins with TBD. And then I want to pivot now on the hours. So I'll go to the transform, I'll tell it to pivot based on that column I have selected. It asks me what should the column headings be, and I want it to be the week of the year. And I did that wrong. I'll go back, let's see, pivot, sort of rows. That did not write what I had. I'll try it again. Pick the hours, pivot on that column, week of year. Maybe I'm doing it backwards. Maybe I need to pick week of year and tell it to pivot on hours. Oh, that's better. I get that confused. Now I have a row for every TBD person, and I have their hours all pivoted. So that's one step, and then I'm going to duplicate this step, and I want to get the people that are, I just did this backwards. This one should be named TBD only. Sorry guys. And this one's no TBD. So on the one that's no TBD, I want to change the filter to be does not contain, where are we at here? Here. Does not begin with, insert a step, TBD. You can see that when it has a step with that name already, it renames, it creates a number at the end of it. Now in this case, I don't want to pivot yet. In this case, if I have a person, for example, Gregory LeBron, I wrote down. I got to type it. No, it's not finding it. There he is. There's a nice feature about this. If you've ever been coding and you've used Debug assert in VBA, Debug assert will stop when it meets a condition. It's kind of a nice way to process a lot of data, but only stop at that one record you know is problematic. Here I put a filter in, and I'm going to make a note that I put that filter in here for debugging. I'm looking at this one guy. He has 20 hours a week for work week 23, but he also down a little bit lower. I'm not sure why it's not showing that. I missed it there. Scroll past. For the same week, he also has 24 hours. So he's supposed to work 44 hours a week. I need to roll this up. So what I'm going to do is group the rows. You're familiar with grouping, I'm sure, with Access. I'm going to group by those columns that I have selected. I want it to give me a sum of the hours for the hours column. And because I'm using this index to help me find bad data, I want it to give me the highest index row that it finds. I have to aggregate it to something, the min, the max. So I'm going to tell it to give me the max of the index. That'll help me later if I have to debug. So now I've rolled up this guy, and I did something wrong because I should only have one row, and it's probably because I included the total hours column. So I can come in here and I can remove the total hours column. And by the way, this is another way where you can have it give you a result of your columns in different order. If you needed to rearrange your columns, the group by can help you do that, as well as the pivot can help you do that. Maybe I want this. No, that's good. That's what I want. So I got one row for Greg. Now I can come back. I can delete that step where I was filtering for Greg. And I've got my columns. So I want to compare my columns. I go discipline, name, number, hours. Discipline, name, number. I don't need total hours in this one. I'm going to remove that column. What column did I remove? I removed the wrong column. Great. So I'll pick this column, remove column. And then I've got my index, and I want to come back to this one and make sure I make the index be the next column. I don't know if I can drag this up. Nope. So I'll do that here. Index, max, max, index. I don't necessarily have to have the index all the time, but I'm going to do it this way. Hours. Okay. Now the data in this query matches the data in this query. Oh, except I didn't pivot. Oh, that's another way I could have gotten those columns in the right order. So I need to do the pivot now. I'm going to pivot the hours column. Looks like I lost the. Where'd my work week column go? I think I got ahead of myself. Yeah, I needed to make sure that the week of year column was included in the sum. So for LeBron, I should have had not one row total. I should have had one row.
Twice, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks for catching that. There, now I've got the week of the year. Now I can pivot on the hours. No, pivot on the week of the year. I'll make the same mistake again. Hours. And now I've got my 4 columns here, and then everything else is a date. And I'll have the same thing with the TBD. Now I can merge these two into one. So I'll go to the Append queries, make a new query. I'll take this one and this one, combine them together. It assumes the columns are in the same order. I'll call this TCT combined dog. And I'm going to close it so I can save it. So it's creating a new sheet in here to hold this data. I can delete a sheet. You can see that it didn't create sheets for all of these. Did it? I think it did. Yeah, it went through and created the sheets. It just named them these random names. But maybe I don't need to see this as a sheet. I can delete this sheet. And this over here will say it's just a connection. So it's a query with no saved data. And that might make your Excel file smaller. I could pick that one also and do the same. I don't feel like I need to do that. So my end result is, where's the combined one at? There it is. This is my end result. Other things I did to it in my pre-baked version is I inserted a few rows, because it's a table object. It'll go wherever the table is. And I put in some calculations above. And because it's a table, I did have to put the formula in like a table. You see, that's not saying column F, it's saying that column in that table. And the reason I point that out to you is if I grab this formula and I copy it across, I think it'll be the same formula all the way across. I didn't drag it right. Well, maybe it's not doing it. But if I copy that formula and I paste it here, it's still referring to work week 19, which is there. So you got to be careful if you're working with a table and you want to drag formulas around. So just to show you that it's all working, I can delete data in here and I can say refresh, and it's going to rerun those steps again, pull that data down. Now I made all these steps. It seems like I'm talking for a long time. I want to give you guys some chance to ask some questions before I show you some more examples. But I want to say that all these steps, you're assuming if you write them right, the next time you get a file that you have to import from somebody, all those steps are going to continue to work. So you'll just be able to drop that file in a folder, open up this Excel file, and just hit refresh, and it'll pull in all that data again. And you guys are familiar enough with Access that you know you can be in an Access database, make a linked table in Access that talks to this spreadsheet and talks to this sheet here, and it'll pull all this data in. So you can import this data into Access really easily, as long as you have to go in, well, at this point, from this example I'm showing you, you'd have to go into Excel first and tell it to refresh, and then go into your Access, and it should import it. I want to program it later. I didn't get time to do that this week, but I wanted to make a button in Access that it will open up Excel, tell it to refresh, and then import the data. So, do you have any questions when I take a drink?
Any questions, everyone?
No, but this is really cool. Very powerful.
All right, I'll show you. Maybe you would take this Power Query file that I'm using to do the importing, and you want to move it somewhere, or you might want to read a file that's in a relative directory and not absolute directory. So I wanted to show you how you can do that. And what I did here is I put a formula in a cell somewhere, and it's talking to A1. Don't worry that it's talking to A1. Basically, this command gives you the path of the current file. So this file is in the C:\dog folder. I select that cell. I create a named range for that cell. Just by typing up here, I can create a named range. Now, when I'm in my Power Query, because it's a named range, I can't talk to a cell in Power Query, but I can talk to a named range. And it's not in this example, but I can put that named range in here. I thought it was in this example. Maybe it's in this one, but it's not. There have been a few cases where I've had to have it refer back to Excel for a formula that Excel's better at than Power Query is. So be aware of that capability. I think I have some more information on my slides before I go to another example. Where's my slides at? Here. So I want to go over the things I think I already mentioned. Your steps can have spaces in the names, but you have to have a pound sign on them. You got case sensitivity. Selecting with the mouse is weird. There's no syntax highlighting, but the editor in Power BI last year got an update, and it has highlighting and IntelliSense. You can't save your changes when you're in the Power Query editor. I have used Notepad++. I highly recommend Notepad++ as a text editor. So I can take a Power Query script and put it in here and then filter it or highlight it. So I took that one earlier, and I can just tell it, hey, this is the M language, because you can define your own languages, and that makes it easier for me to work with. Another cool thing about Notepad++, every time I create a new tab, somebody interrupts me and says, hey, what do you think of this? I can just paste whatever I'm thinking in there, and if my computer reboots or shuts down or whatever, I don't even have to name this file. It'll bring this file back, which is why I'm on number 238. Occasionally I go back and close the ones that I don't need anymore. Some of them it'll bring open files that you had to open earlier too. A cool feature of the scripting language is if you want to share your scripts with somebody or save them or go back and look at them. I was trying to figure out how I could get all the scripts, and I was looking for a VBA way to export and dump all of my scripts. And I started to go down that path, and then I realized you can highlight all of your queries here, hit Control-C, go to Notepad, Control-V, and it pastes them. It's that easy to get a copy of all your scripts. And if you start using this, you will you'll want to go back and find those tricks you use, like the one trick I showed that removes all the columns with the word column in the name. I want to be able to use this over and over again. You can put comments in your scripts too, like you can with some other languages with the / at the prefix. Okay. Back to here. Power Query can connect to a ton of things that Access can't connect to. This slide just kind of gives you an idea. And the next example I'm going to pull up is making a function. There's a company that makes some electrical engineering software. It's pretty much industry standard, but they don't have a very good way to export their data. And my company went to them and said, hey, we really need a way to export this data. Can you make something for us? And we paid them a decent amount of money, and they did what we asked, but we didn't like the result. And I'll show you what that looks like. I was going to show you, I do have it open in here. This is the export they gave us. It's basically a CSV file. This is a table of the bus meaning electrical bus. Here's the column headings for the bus. There's about 25 column headings there, and then there's your data. But as you scroll down in this export file, you get to the next table, the cable table. Cable table has different column headings, different number of columns. So that's the way this file exports. Multiple tables dumped into here in one file. You can't really work with this with Access very well. I mean, you could write your own custom VBA thing for it. I wanted something to see if there was a way with Power Query to do it a lot faster. So I want to show you what I did with that. Data, queries and connections, the bus query. First thing I did is I wrote a query that read that Excel file. There's the CSV file. You can see the bus is on row 11. These are all the different tables that are in here. I was able to create a filter for that. I'm jumping through here a little quick. I'm starting to feel like you might be getting overloaded with information. So I'm jumping through here.
No, this is great, Ben. Keep going.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I think this is the wrong query that I wanted to show. Convert column types. This is a step. I want to show you with it without being. Okay, I made a query that created a column index. I will start again here. I'm finding all the columns that start with / / -- like that. And those are my table headings. I had added an index column. It's all way off to the right. And so when I take everything else out and only have those columns, now I know what the heading row is for each one of these tables. Do a little bit of cleanup, have a nice name there and a nice index. And what I did with that is I loaded that into this list here. This is a table, and I turned that table into a validation list. So someone can open up my Excel file, go in here, there's my validation list. They can pick bus, a little bit of code there that tells this to refresh, or no, I didn't put the code in yet. I was going to put a button to do that. It's going to refresh, and now it's going to give me the bus. So I go up to column V when I do the bus. If I come in here and I tell it I want the cable column, the cable set of data, I get that, and this goes out to column AV, I believe is where I was at. So it adds 20, not very good here. Yeah, completely different layout of this data. Go back in to that function. So what I wanted to say was I wrote this query the first time to process a really easy one like the bus, which was at the top of the list. And I think that's what this is here. And then, maybe this is the cable, but once I wrote it, I took the script for that and I changed a little bit of code at the beginning, and it becomes a function. And this is that function. I can show you the code. So this is a parameter being passed into it. So you pass in bus or cable or utility, whatever section you want to have returned. And that word there is used, I think it does a lookup and gets the row number. I think that's what it's getting. The row count. It figures out what row that table starts at, and then returns the data. I don't want to get in here too far and I get a little bit lost here, but because I want to do the same, the data's in the same structure all the way down, repeatable. It just has different column headings. So I didn't want to have to say, oh, the next table starts on row 300. Now I have to write a query that says delete the first 299 rows and then return the rest until I find a blank line. So that's how you can use a function. I'll show you another example. Do you guys have any questions on this?
Ben, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, as an Access developer, any of us have had to link to Excel to get information. This is the first time I've seen Excel actually be useful other than just a dead data source. It actually becomes a tool an Access developer can use. This is great stuff. Keep going.
Thank you. I think Microsoft should put this Power Query in Access. I think it would be a great way to funnel data right into Access.
George, you want to tell McCall to do that?
Tell McCall?
Order.
Yeah.
I want to see if the next one was on my list. Okay, so this is a little bit of a tough one here. Where's the folder I stored my example in? Okay. I had an Access database that I deployed 10 years ago. They've added a lot of features to it, made the forms more and more complex by adding, retrieving additional columns and multiple lists. And the users were complaining that the database was getting slow. And originally we had 2 to 3 users using it on a team of 100 people. And then slowly over time, more and more people wanted to get their hands in it. And of course, it was just an Access backend. It was slowing down. So I wanted to have a way to figure out where the slowness was in the database, so I knew what to work on to fix it, besides migrating to SQL Server, which is a huge cost. So I wrote a function I called Debug Timer, and I peppered my code with this Debug Timer function. One of the things I had going for me is anytime I tried to open a form, I used a global function because I was already logging who opened what form, because I wanted a way to be able to track which forms are getting used the most. So in that code, I told it to run this function that figures out when they started it, and then I would also be able to detect when that form had finally loaded. So here's a case where they open up this POC assessment form inside this open form function. And then when that form opens, it may report things, it may not, but at least I would get, in that same function, I would know when it ended and I would have a duration. So it took 1.8 seconds from when I told the form to open to when it opened. And then over time, I had added some other commands to functions that get run as that form is opening, because it has to refresh some things. So, and then I told it to write these logs out. So now I have these huge log files and the task of trying to figure out how to analyze this data. So I wrote basically a Power Query that will give me the row number where something starts, give me the task that started, the date it started, who started it, what the name of the database was, and then it needs to find, the Power Query needs to find the last row and give me the row number and the duration. So I want to know that it took 16 seconds for this to open. And then later I can go back by the row number and find the problematic one. So somewhere in here, something took 5 seconds for it to get to the form current to finish. And I guess in my analysis, I think that usually is stuff on the form requerying on its own that you don't really have control over. But at least I know where to look. I can find some, maybe a label field, should say a text field, that has a DLOOKUP in it or something that tells me how many rows are in another list or something. So I needed to be able to analyze that, and Power Query was able to analyze these files. I also have the case where, very similar here, but I have some steps I call blip that may happen anywhere in here, but I wanted to ignore those. So that's not the last step. So I couldn't just tell it, hey, when you find a blank, go to the previous step. It would have, if I would have wrote VBA to do this, it would have been a lot of work to try to analyze this. I can show you my steps in Power Query if you guys want to see that. There's some interesting features I use in that I didn't use in the other ones, but I know we've been talking for a while. I don't know if you want to see more or not. It's up to you.
Well, Ben, we've got at most 15 minutes left. I don't know how the others are feeling. Can you show us another thing within 15 minutes, or do you think it's a good wrap-up point?
My wrap-up is pretty short, so I think I can show you some of the other things Power Query does in this case.
What do you folks think?
Go for it.
It's fine. Yep.
Okay. And that's the SKM. Debug timer logs. We didn't cover all the different steps you can do in the Power Query editor, and I wanted to demonstrate a few of those. This is the final output I get from analyzing that. So I know what event fired, I know what the time was, I know what steps it was on to go look in the log file, and it's sorted by the highest time at the top. So we'll dig into this. We'll just go into the data menu and queries and connections to open that panel on the right side of the screen. And I'll go in here and edit this one. So the source I have this time is a folder. Here are all the files in that folder. So I can filter that down to just text files, and then just text files that have my prefix. There's one of these for every user. And then for debugging, which is really nice, as long as you name this to find it later, I'm going to tell it, hey, just look at this one guy, Clark Kent. But later I'd want to delete this, but I want to make this run fast also. I don't want it every time I refresh for it to have to try to cache. It does a lot of caching. It's pretty smart about that. Sometimes when you open Power Query, it'll tell you this data hasn't been refreshed in 17 days, but it'll still show you data. So that's good. Filtered rows, what's the function? Custom function 1. I think I have another step here. There's a function. Promote headers. That doesn't seem like the right function. I wanted to go through some of these steps. One example here is, let's see if I can find it. I have the path name, and I want to make that path name, or maybe the start time, or the username, appear on every row. And there's a copy down that you can do in this, in Power Query. And I want to find where I did that step. Fill down start time. Because I want to report the first row and the last row, but I only want to return one row for each event, I want to take the data from the first row and move it to the last row. So this is my last row of the event. I want to make sure this start time ends up down there. So I can run a fill down command, and anytime there's a null, it puts that value down there. Now I'm working in a different dimension. The same with the username, I can tell it to do that. But first thing I had to do was tell it, if you find a blank name, like a 0-length string, change it to null first, and then fill it down. I did that with the path. You can have conditions in here, and I can even edit that. So if the elapsed time is 0, blah, 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 then I can tell it what I want to do. And anytime I want to put a thing in there, I can double click this and it puts it over here, so I don't have to type it. I'm adding some columns in here to help me figure out what row we have a break. So I can break things into certain events. And then I can filter out the rows that aren't events. Doing that fill down again. I removed those blip rows, removed those eLookup rows. They weren't very helpful to me when I did final analysis. Looking back, I think it's the fill down that was really helpful for me to get the data and where I want it. I feel like I'm playing chess when I'm moving that data around like that. I also wanted to show you how to, I'm done with that CSV thing. I think it's a little too complicated to try to go through all those steps. I do want to show you how to debug when you have an error. And I want to find that file on my other monitor. Just go back. Bring this file up. Enable content. I'm going to tell this to refresh, and it gets an error. Okay, so this looks like the one we worked on earlier. It's actually a different copy. So I have to figure out what happened. None of these are refreshing right now. I'll go to the one I know is my starting step. I'm going to edit that one. Of course, I could have done that once I had the editor open anyway. So even on like my final step, my final query, it says, hey, there's something wrong with employee number. I can't find that column. So if I go back to my original, because the error is in this query, and you always end up at the last step of the query when you jump to a query, I can hit go to error, and it's going to jump me to that row where I have the error. So the row above this, no error. Here, there's an error. And what I realized happened was, at one point, the file doesn't actually have employee number with that pound sign. Somebody changed the file to say employee num. And so I want to come in here and put in num like that, leave that row, go to the last one, look for any more errors. I'm good on that. I can hit refresh. I think it'll redo these ones. Maybe it won't. I'll go to the last query that I used and I'll look at refreshed on its own. So I wanted to point out the debugging. That's a little bit hard when you get an error and you don't know where to look. Oh, there was another feature that I had, this is, let me pull it up. In one version of my resource loader, we had a column where people were assigned different tasks. So this guy is going to work on that task, and I'm going to narrow this down to employee numbers here. So for each employee number, they may have multiple tasks that they're on. I don't have a field in my database to store that, but I do have a comment field. I want to concatenate this value from multiple rows. And if I do this, let's filter for this guy here. And group and remove. You can see that that guy has been assigned all these different tasks. Now in my database, I want the hours all rolled up, but I still need to know that he's assigned to those tasks. So in Power Query, there is a command, and you can see I put underscores on this one. That helps me see that is a special command. And it creates a delimited list, a semicolon delimited, semicolon space delimited list for that package column. And they'll also be in alphabetic order. So I sorted it first, and then I told it to make a delimited list. Now this guy happens to be assigned to 2 different projects, which is another dimension that I didn't show you. Now that becomes my comment field. And because this query, this is its own query, I have the 2 keys, the employee number and the project number. So I can join to this query from another Power Query to get that comment as a new column. It would be similar to do this here, merge queries, and I could say, hey, take this query, merge it with another query based on employee den going to employee den, and project number going to project number. Oops, I didn't do that right. I think there, I have to hold the control key. And you can see it put a little 1 there and a 2 there and a 2 there and a 1 there. So I could do that, and it'll join those. It'll basically add all the other data. Well, it'll do it as a step. It's kind of interesting. That's all the data from the other table, and then I have to pick what columns I want. And then it'll give me all those columns. And then, of course, I have to remember at the end to go back and turn off my filter that I stuck in there and forgot to give it a special name. So that's something that's hard to do in SQL, is to take multiple rows and concatenate them into one row, into a cell on one row. But Power Query lets you do that.
Oh, I do it all the time with user-defined functions.
Yes, but they're slow. I've done it before too, but if you have a lot of data, that can...
You're not supposed to point that out, Ben.
Okay. It's great to run in a nightly process, I'll say that. I did do a trick, I just learned this trick making this demo is, you can see I have 2 copies of Power Query open, and I said it was modal. Well, I don't know how I did this, but I ended up opening a second instance of Excel. And when I tried to do this one day, it wouldn't let me do it. But I actually have, this Excel must be running in a different process. So I can have Excel open here and Power Query and still not be locked out of this. So if you know the trick to opening Excel in another process, that'll do that. Okay, I think I've done enough rambling. Are there any questions?
Any questions, anyone? No?
Well, can you set this to run through Excel? I mean, through Access? Running a script?
I think it should be possible. Because from Access, you can automate Excel, and you can tell Excel to refresh. All you really need to do is make it Access VBA hit this button for you.
That should be very easy.
Now, there is another trick that I want to show you that I learned. I think it's in here. I wanted, in my template that people can use to fill in and enter these, I wanted to have an easy-to-use list of names. So they can type in Bill and shows all the bills, and they don't have to go into that guy's employee number, and they can hit OK, and it'll throw his row in here. I built this pop-up window, but I wanted it to be loaded with real names. And I want to be able to distribute this template, and the names are changing all the time. So I made a Power Query that calls a database and gives me a list of names. And if I hit this button right now, it'll requery this. And actually what it's going to do, neat kind of thing, is it's actually calling a stored procedure, because I didn't want it to have a hard-coded query. And I wanted to have a parameter for my stored procedure. So it started out as TCT1, but if I call it TCT2, it gives me the name formatted in a little bit different way. I made a couple different variants. So once it's out in the user's hands, they can choose a different method to requery. But the point I wanted to get was, after you initiate a requery, Excel VBA does not tell you when that query finishes. And I had a step where after it was finished running this, I wanted it to invoke a formula and copy that formula all the way down for how many rows that I had. It was a step that I had been fooling around with it. I'm not using now, but I found out that you can create a class in Excel, VBA class. You can bind that class to the table, and then when I'm trying to open it up right now, there we go. Then when that table refreshes, a new event will fire. An after refresh event will fire. So then in the after refresh event, I'm able to figure out what the heck they were just trying to refresh. So if they were trying to refresh the employee list, then I call a function that does something to it. So that's if you're working with these tables that are bound to a database, that's kind of a neat trick to know that's there. Well, it's not really there. You have to make it there. And I don't know how that would automate from Access. I don't know that you would need to. Okay, Ben, we have reached our limit, and Microsoft likes us to leave the facility on time. So I'm going to have to cut you off there. You obviously have more good stuff to show us, but this was a great presentation. I think everyone will agree. You all agree?
Oh, yes.
Yes.